Welcome everyone to the April 9th meeting of SIG-Auth. We have a light agenda today. First up is Mo. You put down, it's time for us to talk about authentication of webhooks.
Yeah, so I can get started. So I think probably everyone on this call is well familiar with the recent pile of Ingress Nginx CVEs. The one I linked there is, I think, the relevant one for this discussion, which is the RCE on the admission controller. And so certainly that admission controller should have been better designed such that an arbitrary request cannot cause an RCE to it. But the complete lack of authentication obviously makes it much worse because all you need is service level access, service network level access on the cluster, which depending on how your networking is configured could be very broad. Yeah, the general gist of my thought process here is, so today it is technically possible to have authentication to admission webhooks, but it is not practical for cloud provider environments because the configuration for authentication is an API server CLI command config. And webhooks tend to be installed at runtime, and certainly people have many custom webhooks that are unaware of any of the cloud provider configuration. So it is problematic, and the default that seems to have evolved in the ecosystem is to have no authentication. So if you can reach the network endpoint of the admission webhook, it will respond to you. In the past, my concerns around this have only really been about like privacy leaks, where you have an admission webhook that understands like the policy of your environment, and you can just keep asking it questions, and it'll just keep telling you yes or no about those questions, which isn't like the end of the world, but it's not super great, right? Like if you have like gatekeeper or something configured that enforces policy for your environments, it's probably not great that it'll answer arbitrary questions about those things. But this specific CV, also points out that not all admission controllers are necessarily going to be well written or well behaved if passed in inputs that are not nice. So it'd be really nice if at just like a baseline ecosystem level, we made it practical for people to have authentication at this layer in a way that's easy to use and works in most or all environments. I realize that the ship has certainly sailed on existing admission webhooks, and those will need to be updated to do something no matter what. But I think the step zero of all of this is it needs to be possible and easy, and then hopefully the ecosystem over time will adapt. I guess I'll pause there and see if folks have thoughts or feedback.
Yeah, I mean, let's do.
I didn't prepare well for this. I was trying to find like past places where we talked about this. I know we've talked about this in person, and I thought there had been a couple issues or discussions, but they were probably buried in PRs or something. Just to kind of give more specificity to like what exactly we're wanting to pursue. So like authentication in terms of TLS or tokens, and specified where and how, like as inline in the webhook admission configs or referenced into a secret, or a Boolean that says get tokens and send them to this thing. I feel like we've had a lot of sort of discussions around pieces of that and was trying to find links to those. So maybe a first step would be like digging up those discussions and kind of sketching out like what are people even envisioning. And then we can think about like how it connects to various things that have happened over the years in terms of service account tokens that can be audience scoped, or more capabilities around certificate request generation, signing things. Just sort of start mapping those into possibilities to evaluate.
Yeah, so I remember, I think it was a GKE person, right, that had, I think, started a KEP, but then I think ended up not pursuing it after a while. I vaguely recall this. I feel like I've also done that research now that I realize.
You have a link that would, I can't remember.
Well, I know this has to be. So give me a second. I'll see if I can find it.
Yeah.
Bell.
Anyway, I like, in principle, I like the idea of being able to have API servers identify themselves to webhooks. I don't want to make it easy for people to shoot themselves in the foot and like put a token hard coded into an admission webhook that's readable via the API and sprayed out to all webhooks so that webhooks can steal it. So whether it's dynamic token, like audience scoped token generation, or non-replayable credentials like a certificate or something, like there are different things that seem like they could be acceptable, but I don't want to make it easy to do the dumb thing and like hard code a token that gets sprayed out and stolen.
I'm gonna paste this link. I think this was Micah, if you want to click on it. I think this was it, right? This is the one I'm remembering. Does this look familiar, Jordan?
Vaguely. Yeah, I remember this. Okay. Wow, that was like 6 years ago. That's why I remember it very well. Yeah. So
6 years ago, it would have rolled out to the ecosystem by now.
I don't even know if we had the stuff in place for getting the discovery information to validate the tokens at that point.
No, I don't think that was. I don't think bound service account tokens with audience scoping was the thing yet.
We had bound service account tokens, but they were done with token review stuff. So I don't know that I would want to force webhooks to use token review. It seems like they should be able to get keys and like validate a token.
Yeah.
Yeah, so grabbing that's a great thread. I think that's probably the most fleshed out proposal. Looks like it was heading in the direction of like a Boolean to say like get provision a service account token of some sort, which could be reasonable. A lot has changed in the last 6 years, so it'd be worth thinking about like, do we want to instead go in the direction of like a certificate thing, or support both? Like you can get a token that's audience scoped, or you can get a certificate. Yeah, we should just think about like the things we're working on now and have worked on in the last 6 years, and which things make sense to intersect with this.
I think with certs, I think we have two problems. One is they're hostile to network proxies, which may or may not be an issue in this case. I think the other thing is to hear stuff on pod certificates hasn't landed, and I think that's like the only like super good way right now that we're pursuing for generating certs. Like, I mean, yes, we have the CSR API, but like,
I mean, for this use case, the cert doesn't need to be done. Like the cert itself could be one cert and key that is passed in Cube API server configuration. We'd have to define like which CA it's supposed to, like which logical CA it's supposed to come from, but
oh,
we don't
yeah.
need to mint them on the fly. For this
Yeah,
use
I
case.
guess, yeah. So you don't have to mint them on the fly. So you're thinking we could maybe have like a well-known cluster trust bundle.
Yeah, some way we publish it. I don't even know if cluster trust bundle is nice for in cluster webhook backends. If you're running an out of cluster webhook backend, you're still kind of on your own for like getting that trust out of the cluster and into your webhook backend. But I don't know if there's a better way. Maybe if we make up like a core like OpenID discovery doc equivalent API, maybe.
Yeah, I mean that's the benefit of the service account token based flow, right? Is we already have the whole YDC discovery stuff on API server, and it is externalized in the cloud providers. So if you have an externalized webhook, that is a well understood path for verifying tokens. So I think the other aspect of this that I don't know has been explored is what like when you consider the fact that it's not just Cube API server, right? It's also aggregated API servers that need to call out to this. I think you need to have some mechanism for authorization. And I'm not 100%.
What do you mean?
So let's say you have aggregated API servers running. They need to be able to call these admission webhooks, right? With some credential. That credential may not be the same credential that Cube API server uses. So you have at least N credentials of some sort that have to be verifiable. And so somehow all the webhooks on your cluster need to understand those N credential sources effectively as like the set of authorized users, right? And so if we think about like service account tokens as the mechanism, right? Aggregated API servers and the Cube API server can both use service account tokens, but so can like any other workload on the cluster that can have a pod. So it couldn't just be all service accounts from the cluster, and it couldn't. Yeah, so there would have to be some way of saying like, I meant for this one to be able to call that webhook. Right.
Yeah, I mean the webhook backend will have to check for. I'm assuming we would have some special like system colon Cube API server like subject, whether it's in the cert, whether we're using certs or tokens. Like the subject would have to identify the fact that this isn't just a random service account. This is a Cube API server. So like the webhook, you're right. The webhook has to have some authorization layer after it. It can't just validate the token and say.
Yeah. So a webhook server that only expects to intercept admission requests for APIs served by Kube API server has it easy, I guess. An admission webhook that is like generic and maybe is doing label policy, and so it's configured so that every namespaced resource gets sent to it. Well, now it needs to, if there are aggregated servers in the cluster, those are going to call out to it as well. And so I can see how it could work, but you're right. The webhook, depending on what it's expecting to intercept, will have to be able to, in addition to figuring out the identity, decide like, is this identity allowed to call me? and ones that intercept stuff from Kube API server and from aggregated API servers. That's like the hardest thing to figure out. So we should figure out how that will work.
Yeah. So like a high level, I've thought of like two ways. One is the obvious way of token review and subject access review, which is not great if you want to have your webhooks off the cluster. I do think we could make it very easy for people to implement because we do have kubeRBAC proxy, which is working its way through its wall of issues to become an official project. So it could certainly have a mode to support this. It's not super great because I think it makes the bar relatively high still. And things running off cluster probably can't call back into the cluster to do subject access review, even if they could skip token review by doing
The right multiplication effect of having like
Yeah.
one API request hit like call back to Kube API server like multiple times for every admission plugin is so bad.
It's not great. The other way I thought of doing this, which is incredibly kludgy, so before I even say it is, today when you make a service account token, you can just put in whatever audience you want. You could introduce some layer of authorization for what audiences you can ask for based on the service account's permissions. So that way you would have to assign it like RBAC or something to do that. It's super kludgy, but then it allows the webhook to just say, I just have to do OIDC verification. And the scheme, and it can just basically rely on the API server to assert the scheme.
That's not what audiences are for. That's
I'm aware that they're supposed to identify that it is meant for a particular target.
So maybe we shouldn't design it that way.
Add fields to token request, I guess, that say I want a new bit set that says I'm supposed to be calling admission webhooks.
It's like a scope. Only that's also not what scope is supposed to be. Scope is supposed to be a subset of what the user can already do. Anyway,
scopes are a mistake. Like, no,
I think most of OAuth can be described as a mistake. So, so maybe not. Yeah. So I don't know. I suspect part of the reason we haven't solved this is because it's not easy or obvious to solve.
Let me throw one other aspect out there just for people to think about. So I think today on GKE, we use the existing configuration, like the weird as kube config that you can specify.
Mm-hmm.
So like to authenticate to webhooks that are hosted on like googleapis.com, we say, okay, run our credential helper, and the credential helper pulls a service account token from like the VM metadata server and does some other stuff with it.
This is a GCP service account, right? Not a
yeah, GCP service account. Yeah. So it would be really like if we wanted to move GKE from that more bespoke thing to this new standard thing, one thing that would be really convenient is if there was a way to specify, give me the like a token for this audience with, whatever subject we decide this sort of token should have, and then send it to an RFC 8693 token exchange endpoint. And then the resulting credential is the one you send to the webhook.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So we kind of want to do the cloud provider credential exchange style that we do for work with identity and basically all the clouds.
I mean, I think we could make it work, like if the webhook just posts the JOT, but it's like much less standard in our Google stack. I don't know about AWS or Azure, how your service authentication stacks work, but like ideally the webhook, yeah.
I hate our authentication stack, so there's that.
If if you don't hate your authentication stack, you don't know it well enough. I think I've come to that conclusion, like with every stack I've ever looked at. Like, oh, this seems clean, and then you look under the covers, you're like, oh, that's horrible.
Yeah.
That's why we have abstractions. It's great. Yeah. So I think it would help to sort of think about the dimensions, think about like the fewer options we support, the easier it is for backends to write stuff because they don't have to handle as much variety, right? The more options we support, it's like, well, I might have a token, or I might have a cert, or I might have a token that's not a Kubernetes service account token, or I might have a token I have to use token review for, or I might have a token that's like some cloud exchanged token. Like it is the you need to think about it from the perspective of someone writing a webhook backend that doesn't know what type of cluster they're going to be deployed in, right? So generic gateway or whatever, not gateway, gatekeeper backend. Like they don't know what kind of cluster they're going to be deployed in. They might go into a standalone cluster or an on-prem cluster or GKE or AWS or Azure. Like they don't know. And so are they going to be on the hook for sort of supporting every flavor of authentication that could show up, or is there a well-defined, like, this will work in every type of conformant cluster that exists flavor that sort of community backend, webhook backends could implement and say, configure your webhook this way, and you can authenticate this way, and I know I'll just work everywhere.
Right.
That's the main thing I want to make sure we can.
Not that I'm arguing for, like, let's.
Yeah. And then like the sort of bespoke things where we have existing things we would want to migrate to it. Like what would it take to support that, where you're going to write a backend and it's only ever going to run in this environment, and you want to get a very specific token a very specific way. Like if we can make those things possible without it being super complicated and ugly, that would be nice as well. But keeping those use cases straight and making sure I can write a reasonable webhook backend and have reasonable confidence I can deploy and configure it in all different kinds of clusters. Like that seems like the baseline requirement in my mind.
I do think the logical conclusion from that requirement is a minimalistic standardized approach, right? Because it's basically the only way for that to be tractable, right? If you tell webhook authors there's like 7 things you have to support, they'll just say, I won't bother.
Yeah. And it has to be end to end. Like, here's what your admission webhook registration looks like. Here's what you have to put in the manifest. Here's what you have to do on the back end. If there's other connecting things, like you have to have a service account, or you have to have a namespace, or you have to have a certificate signer, like we just have, like, what are all the things you have to do? So their manifest that says, here's my deployment, so my pods go out, and here's my admission webhook config, so it registers my webhook. Like, what else do I need to stick in there? This sort of connects to like other things we leave as exercises for the deployer, like the CA bundle on the admission webhook config. Like today, whoever deploys it has to populate that with a good CA for verifying the thing. Like we don't give any help there. So if we're thinking like holistically, like this conversation is about like how does the webhook make sure the thing talking to it is good, but we sort of have exercise for the deployer stuff like the CA. So how does the API server know that the webhook is good as well? If we're looking at how to make this stuff possible or easier, might be good to, and we're thinking about like how would a webhook config reference a certificate or a certificate request or something that says make me a certificate so I can call this. Would it also make sense to think about how I can reference a cluster trust bundle instead of inlining? So not that it has to be part of like the same mega effort, but we want to make it possible and reasonable for like, people to deploy webhooks that are secured in both directions. So
Good. I think that makes sense to me. I know we haven't done planning for like 134, and I suspect we'll do that in the next biweekly after we have some time in the triage meetings to go through it as a pre-step. I guess, is anyone interested in leading this effort? And if they are, when? We don't
I
have
mean,
to.
I'm interested, but I don't think I should do that until I've got the certificate stuff landed.
Yeah.
You should
I'm slow enough
make
as
your
it is.
cluster trust bundle and certificate stuff lands, because I'm pretty sure that's going to be like a prereq to this in some sense.
Yeah. I mean, Cluster Trust Bundle is beta now, and we've already done what, like 2 reviews to hear this the cycle for pod search. So
Yeah.
I think that'll land. I think right now we're just waiting because I think David's on PTO, so I think let's pause the reviews right now. So yeah, I think the general statement though I would make there is we probably should finish the existing stuff we have before we add new stuff to our plate. I suspect that means it's probably not pragmatic to schedule this for 134.
Yeah, if we're talking about like connections and validation and stuff, I would rather see us make progress on the API server to kubelet identity validation, like the extra TLS validation. I would be focusing on that before this.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, we have a cap open for that one, right?
Yes, it kind of hit a block in like practical implementation, I think.
Yeah, remember I showed you how to do it without crazy, atrocious connection level shenanigans?
I don't remember that.
Oh, okay. So look
This
back
was-
through your back history. I
This
guess.
is the HTTP client stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah. So the way I came up to do it was inside of our handler logic, the HTTP handler logic setup. We have one spot where we can wrap the TLS connection dialing logic, and there we can add extra checks if we want, and those could be runtime dynamic based on like values passed into the context. So you would still just have one connection, but every time you go through the handler, you could make it so that well, every time the handler causes a new TLS connection to be made, which would be obviously different TLS connections per kubelet, it could perform a check without having to have like infinite number of clients, one per kubelet.
Okay. We should circle back to that and see if we can describe that more specifically or kind of make a proof of concept and get that unblocked.
Cool. I think that's probably all for this topic. I don't know if we still have some time, if anyone has anything else they want to discuss, or we can call it.
I mean, if someone wants to start sort of gathering the stuff we talked about and accumulating that doc and like laying out the options and doing that evaluation, I think it would be good to let that conversation and that evaluation happen over like the 134 timeframe, and maybe hopefully get something we could pin down and start implementing a thing in like 135. So if we don't start this discussion now, we're unlikely to be ready to code an alpha in 135.
That is fair.
And that will also give Cluster Trust Bundle and Pod Certificate like another release to land. Like Cluster Trust Bundle could go GA in 135. Like that seems plausible to me. So if we end up needing like cluster trust bundle as a prereq for this thing, it would be really nice if that was starting to become broadly available.
Yeah. Cluster trust bundle does have well, maybe in this case it doesn't matter. Yeah, maybe. But cluster trust bundle spans API server and kubelet, so it's harder feature for people to consume because they have to have everything upgraded to the 132 plus level.
Yeah, I mean, if it starts as alpha in 135, if you want to use an alpha,
that's true.
Make sure your cluster and kubelets are new, and then by the time it like gets to beta and GA, the oldest kubelets are supporting cluster trust bundle.
Yeah.
Ish. Yeah.
I had one topic. We don't need to spend much time on it. I was just curious if it's been discussed before or if other people might find it useful. So we just mentioned RFC 8693 token exchange for the Cube API server authentication use case. But one thing that I've thought that in passing might be useful is if kubelet projected token volumes could also do that same exchange. So you say, inject me a token with this audience. And by the way, here's the parameters for an RFC 8693 token exchange. And then the token inside the volume becomes like a cloud provider's token.
I actually don't know much about the that RFC. Anytime we get to tell the kubelet to like go talk to random endpoints and send it random parameters, I get squeamish, but I don't know how like constrained we could be. I know like some of the things with like probes, pod liveness probes and things had weird knobs where you could like set host fields and like make the kubelet go talk to weird stuff.
It's fairly constrained, but like basically it's you post the token to an HTTP endpoint and there's a couple, like a JSON body with a couple parameters, one holding the token, one holding like some fixed string that identifies this as a token exchange. And then you can name basically the issuer that you're supposed to be exchanging through. It's all meant to work. It like works well complementing OIDC and OIDC discovery.
Yeah. I think the specific part Jordan's asking about, though, I think you end up needing like API server level guardrails to make sure that people can't ask kubelet to like reach out to random endpoints and do stuff against them.
I guess would the config look like here's an endpoint to go exchange tokens with or something?
I would think so. Yeah, like just right below where you put the audience, you would also put the URL of a token exchange endpoint.
Yeah, that makes me squeamish about DNS. Remember the time of check, time of use issues. Yeah.
And there's ways we've done things in the past where like you can reference things in the pod spec sort of just by name, and that has to correspond to a thing that the admin sets up. So it's like an allow listed.
Like constraining the sort of profiles we would allow.
Yeah, so like you can reference like localhost AppArmor profiles or seccomp profiles, and like the admin has to have defined that on the node by name, and if you try to use it and it's not on the node, then it's like, sorry, this doesn't exist. That takes a lot of the
that makes sense. Yeah.
Out, but it's also like very non-portable and very non-discoverable. So you're basically writing a pod spec for a specific provider. It's like in this node pool, we've defined the foo, localhost seccomp profile. And so I write my pods and I say use profile foo, and it just is there. And so that's not a portable config, but I don't know.
But you could do the same thing, but with like the way we did the cluster trust bundle, right? Where you could have a REST API that defines the shared state that is the right access to which is clearly a cluster admin action, and then the consumption of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's possibilities. I think the security aspect and the discoverability aspect and the fiddliness aspect of it. Like I don't know how many parameters there are, but if you're making everybody like put in full URLs and complicated parameters, people are gonna mess it up. And so it's nice to encapsulate that sort of in a here's the cloud token exchange parameters. Anyway, those are the dimensions I would think about. And I'm not that familiar with the exchange RFC.
So here is the Google token exchange RFC. Is it compliant with that RFC?
Yeah. I would think most are. I don't know. I didn't
No.
like survey everybody. No.
It's just not 100% not.
But maybe like with a profile mechanism, it could be a little more flexible in terms of the actual post request that gets sent out.
I guess what would you do today if you needed this? You would do it as like a CSI.
Well,
And
yeah, or what we do in Google Cloud is we ship a fake metadata server that's running in the cluster, and then your cloud needing applications know to call that metadata server.
Yeah.
Do the
So
same
they
thing.
so they need network visibility themselves from the workload, and they call to it directly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean
That's
the
what
way
we do.
in Azure is in the SDKs, right? We just the app picks up the service account token and sends it to the Azure specific endpoint, and it gets a token and does its Azure.
We also support that mode, but we don't use it that much because people like expect the metadata server to be there. So it's like before that, like it doesn't require any special configuration on our client libraries.
Yeah. Tickling the metadata endpoint and saying, give me a token.
We're working very hard to get rid of that, so that way you don't do that.
Ours is similar in with it exchanges the server's account projected token for credentials.
The pod identity on EKS last time I checked sent it to a local daemon set, which then sent it to a remote service and got back some EKS credit and handed it all the way back.
Oh, so for EKS, there's not an RFC 8693 either. It's like a
There's not for AWS.
Okay.
No, we don't do OAuth anywhere. Unless you count incognito, which is a way to get some kind of OAuth cred to get AWS creds.
So yay, it's a standard that one person implements. Best standard ever.
No, that's not true. I also know that JFrog Artifact implements.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess probably the limiting factor is who would actually be able to use this.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. My least favorite part about OIDC is everything is optional. Makes it
So I think technically to use this RFC, like it's coupled to OAuth, but if you actually look at the request, like what it actually specifies, there's no OAuth-ness, like, or there's nothing that actually constrains that token that you're posting to be an OAuth token, or the token that you get back to be an OAuth token. They could just be,
yeah.
It's literally just like, here's my credential. If I have it, that means I'm authorized to get this other corresponding credential. Give it to me. But anyways, all right, thanks.
I think that's everything. Anyone else have any topic they want to bring up? Okay, calling it. Thanks, folks. We will see you in 2 weeks.